Councillor Meyers, thanks so much for taking the time today. We're working on some data journalism at the Green Line and trying to assess who gets subways, who gets subway stops, and who doesn't in Toronto. And so we have a couple of graphs here. I want to actually just be able to show you these graphs and get your reaction to these graphs. So that is broken down how many subway stops there are per 100,000 residents. And as you can see, it's not exactly equal here in Toronto. What's your reaction to that graph?
I mean, first reaction, it would be interesting to see how North York would fit into this because they do have the Shepherd Subway. But I mean, this graph, it comes as no surprise that Scarborough is obviously underserved when it comes to subway stops. There are a lot of different reasons for that. One of them is just, geography. Scarborough is 1/3 the landmass of the city of Toronto, about 20 to 25% of the population. We don't have high concentrations of people that generally justifies building a subway. Now, that being said, there have been instances where subways have been built in lower density populations. I'm thinking Vaughan, Shepherd Subway. So it's not to say that it can't exist, but there are many factors as to why a subway may or may not make sense in Scarborough. Although I am very, very happy to see that the Scarborough Subway is under construction and the last terminus will actually be in my stop. My ward. Scarborough North, yeah.
That's right. And the Shepherd extension will also go through Scarborough North?
So that's
eventually?
to be determined. So one of the things that we are, hopeful for is that at the very least, the Shepherd extension will go to Shepherd and McCowan. So that way the loop will be continued. It may go further than that, all the way up to Meadowvale. However, that's not the decision that the City of Toronto makes. That would be a decision for Metrolinx and the Province of Ontario.
Gotcha. So I have another graph here highlighting some of these inequities. And what this basically shows is that the more racialized a ward is in Toronto, there's a correlation, which is not necessarily causation, but the more racialized a ward is Toronto, on average, the fewer subway stops there are. The most subway stops, University Rosedale. No surprise there, it's smack dab in the middle of the city. And the fewest stops are a number that are at zero. But there's your ward right at the end.
Yes.
The most racialized and zero subway stops.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a lot of factors. The subway was first built in Toronto. So back then, building subways, of course, was far less expensive. When the subway was first built, I believe it was in 1952, perhaps. So that's a factor. There were reasons as to why the Bloor-Danforth extension stopped at Kennedy. I understand there was politics back then as to how far it would go. Back then, there was different perceptions of whether or not a subway was beneficial for a community. A lot of people looked down upon subways as a way to keep certain people out of certain communities. So communities were built around the car. And you saw this phenomena in the United States as well. So and I'm not sure what the historical reasons were. I just know that was part of the discussion, I'm sure, back then. Then there was also the fact that Scarborough was made a host for an experimental technology for the Scarborough RT. The Scarborough RT's natural lifespan, I believe, was 50 years, and we extended that by another perhaps 20 years. So there were a lot of different reasons as to why we ended up in the place that we did. We're grateful now that we are getting a subway stop. So I suspect if you ask me this in 10 years, Scarborough North will at least have one subway stop. And we are looking at other forms of transportation as well. So the Eglington East LRT. A significant portion of the Eglington East LRT will go through Scarborough North. So it will be looping to connect with Shepherd and McCowan. It will also be going up north with a terminus at Malvern Town Centre. So that would be a significant boost in the number of transit stops in Scarborough, particularly, and just the number of transit stops serving racialized people. That constitutes a significant part of Scarborough's population.
Do you think that the Line 1 extension and the Shepherd line, the Purple Line should have been prioritized before the Scarborough Subway extension, when we knew for some time the RT was going to go out of commission?
So that's a difficult question. I'm sure your viewers may or may not know, there was an entire LRT network plan for Scarborough called Transit City. And part of those lines are now being constructed. So Finch West LRT, Eglington Crosstown, but Scarborough was supposed to essentially have 50 LRT stops, all paid for by the province. There was to be the Shepherd East LRT, there was to be the Eglington East LRT, and there was to be a replacement along the current SRT route called the Scarborough LRT. Altogether, that would have been 50 stops. Obviously, City Council made the decision in 2010 after the election of Rob Ford to scrap that plan in favor of a subway. So that led to some of the predicament that we find ourselves in today. Going forward, I think it's hard to say because you're really guessing, but a lot of these decisions, unfortunately, about who gets transit were political. So I suspect a big reason why Shepherd got a subway was the mayor of the amalgamated city was Mel Lastman, who was at the time before that the mayor of North York. So obviously he would have had a big role in pushing for a subway there. And it just, there was a lot of factors as to why things turned out the way they did. David Miller, who was from Parkdale, had a plan for Scarborough Transit, but unfortunately politics got in the way. However, I am glad to see that something is finally being built. The subway is on track. It's in my ward. I see it every day, or not every day. I see it regularly. It's on track, and I think that there's an opportunity to learn lessons from this as to we don't want transit decisions being made on the floor of City Council. We want transit decisions made by experts after they've done proper community consultations, after they looked at different things such as the financial sustainability of any plan, what's the environmental impacts, what are the opportunities for economic development, further expansion. And I think that was the lesson everyone has taken away from how we do transit going forward in the City of Toronto.
Speaking of the Scarborough Subway extension timeline, there still seems to be a lack of clarity about that from Metrolinx. We were communicating with them previously to figure that out. If the original date of 2030 was still the date, as TTC Board Chair, do you have any insight into that?
So we have, had, I wouldn't say concerns, we've had similar questions as to when we can expect the Scarborough Subway to open. Is it on time? The official date we've received is 2030. However, we've been sort of established in sort of an ongoing discussion group with Metrolinx to see if there are any delays that they anticipate, so that just that we can get ready to understand if we have to tell our communities, hey, this will be, the Scarborough Subway will be delayed, which will obviously have impacts for the TTC in terms of the type of service that we'll be running to supplement the lack of subway into Eastern Scarborough.
There were some delays in regards to the busway, at least in terms of getting shovels on the ground and the planning process. And so if the Scarborough Subway extension doesn't open by 2030, that means for Scarborough Transit users, that much more important that the busway opens sooner. What's the latest on the busway open?
So, thanks to Mayor Chow's 2024 budget, 60% of the busway is being completed. The funding is there. We're currently designing. So that money that we've allocated in the budget, that was about $60 million, is being used to acquire property needed for the busway, and it's being used to rip out the tracks of the ground so that we can start planning out how the busway will be going forward. I was very proud before Mayor Chow came in to actually help lead those discussions in getting the city to fund the design of the busway. So that was about $2.4 million. We worked very closely with Deputy Mayor McKelvey's office in finding a consensus as to how we would find the money. It was about $2.4 million. And all 6 Scarborough councillors were able to get on board, as well as the rest of the City Council, in finding money to design the busway so that when Mayor Chow came in, there was actually a plan to fund, and in her budget we did find that money by reallocating some money off of lesser priority projects into a higher priority project, which would be, of course, the Scarborough Bus Way.
And so what is the current estimated completion date for the busway?
So the official estimated completion date is late 2026, mid 2027.
Okay.
However, that is an estimate based on 60% design. Once they get to 100% design, that timeline might change.
Is there anything that has sort of been anticipated as might be an obstacle to that opening day?
The land acquisition. So some of the land is owned by condominiums. And it's a quirk of real estate law where I think you have to get a very high threshold of condominium owners to agree to sell the land. So that could be an obstacle. As you go, things change. So we just want to make sure that we're not sort of giving a false timeline as to when this thing will be open, and just sort of being realistic about what are the options available. Your viewers may or may not know that we also have to complete an environmental assessment. So that was something we hadn't anticipated originally. So that, again, those just add to the timeline. But of course, we're working through those. TTC officials are, they know this is a priority for both the mayor and myself, as well as the rest of the TTC board and everybody in Scarborough who takes transit. So this is a priority project for everyone.
Right now, there's a budget shortfall, as we all know, and Mayor Chow was disappointed that the federal government did not include any funding for replacement trains in this latest federal budget. What's your response to that?
Well, I think we also have to, before I respond, obviously there's disappointment, but we also have to acknowledge that the federal government has been a partner in funding transit, capital projects in particular. So they provided funding for the Scarborough Subway, they've provided funding for the extension up into York Region, they've provided, and we anticipate that they will be providing us with funding, for example, for the Eglington East LRT as well as the Waterfront East LRT. That being said, we are disappointed that they didn't provide the funding, the $758 million requested for the Line 2 trains. The Line 2 trains are about 30 years old. The City of Toronto has set aside $758 million to refurbish the trains, in addition to, I believe it's $400 million to implement automatic train control on the Line 2 system. Right now, it's done manually. Right. As part of the New Deal agreement between the mayor and Premier Doug Ford, the province has agreed to also allocate $758 million for the purchase of the trains on the condition that the federal government steps up with its funding. Eventually, the trains will need to be funded, so we don't have any doubt about that. At some point, the federal government will come in. However, the issue is the longer the trains are in service, they have to be refurbished, they have to be maintained. That money will then have to come out of the city's money of $758 million to do these refurbishments, to do this maintenance. And then when the time does come to buy these trains, we're going to again have to make up that money somehow.
And there's some urgency to the matter in the sense that the trains ideally need to be purchased by, is it 2026?
Ideally, yes. The longer the trains are delayed, just the more expensive they become, and the more money has to be sunk into refurbishing the existing trains.
So right now, the federal government is out on that count, and the provincial government is not in until the federal government is in. Is there anything the city can do to raise revenue to fund transit better?
So there are things, obviously we're limited by the City of Toronto Act in terms of what types of taxes that we can implement. We had a very unusual budget year in 2024 where we had to agree to quite a significant tax increase. We're not living under a rock. This increase came at the same time many people are struggling with an affordability crisis in that they might own a home, but they're not particularly well off. So we are under no illusions that we need to be very conscious about how we raise money, and people want to see their money being put to use. So before we go down that route, again, our preference is to make the federal government come to the table and fund the transit that they're paying for. Remember, they're paying for the Scarborough Subway, they're paying for the extension up to York Region. So now we need the trains to actually run to these new stations. So eventually we will get there, we're quite confident. The federal government has been a good partner. and they understand the importance of making sure that Toronto has a functioning transit system for the economic health of the city.
I believe there's been two city reports on a commercial parking levy, one in August and one more recently. I think the one in August was looking at $1.50 per parking space, and that would generate an estimated $490 million, almost $500 million.
Yeah.
The more recent report was looking at a two-tiered system, a Zone A and a Zone B, one being 50 cents per parking space, the other 25 cents, and that would generate $150 million per year. Do you support either of those measures, those models?
I have to, before I answer that, I'll just caution. When we looked at the original commercial parking levy, we looked at all parking lots. So we didn't distinguish between a parking lot for a hospital, a university, a shopping mall. We just looked at what are all the parking spots available, and if we applied $1.50 to them, how much revenue would we generate? So once we actually do the deep analysis, I suspect most people do, that the number of $500 million will be lower in terms of how much revenue can be anticipated to be raised from this. That being said, I did vote in support of the commercial parking levy, as I believe it's just one of the tools available to raise money to do sort of the state of good repair that we need for many things in the cities, including roads, especially potholes, transit, bridges, water fountains, water pipes, those kinds of things.
There's an estimated 1 million parking spaces, and the full analysis hasn't been completed, but do you think there's probably a number in between 150 million and 490 million that that could be generated?
I mean, I don't want to speculate just because I don't know what percentage of parking spots would actually be in this commercial parking levy, and then what would we go with a Zone A and a Zone B? So I actually don't know. Is it half of the parking spots are available for this tax? And then if of that half, how many fall in Zone A, how many fall in Zone B? So I actually don't want to speculate, but I did vote to support the tax for the commercial parking levy just because I believe that it is important to raise revenue to get ahead of some of the state of good repair that we're doing, that we're currently doing. I believe we have quite a large deficit of backlogs in terms of things that we need to fix in the city to keep the city moving and working.
What would you say to your fellow city councillors who did not vote for that commercial parking levy? I believe Brad Bradford called it a stupid idea.
I mean, I'm not going to get into criticizing my colleagues. Everybody has their own viewpoints and ideas as how to fix things. I would just say if they don't support the levy, where is the money coming from to do the fixes that we all know need to be done? I mean, you can just take a walk in our city. You can see the garbage bins are falling apart. You can see the potholes in the roads. You can see people sleeping on the streets. You can see grass is overrun. You can see litter. I mean, this is not the Toronto that many of us, myself included, who grew up here, remember. We know our city can do a lot better, but we know that's going to take money. But we're also realistic in terms of it's not just asking people for more money, more taxes. It's looking at the way we do things at City Hall and can we do things better in terms of delivering better services and just looking at different models as to how we do that.
Looking at the issue of Scarborough Transit really broadly, you were voted in October 2022. So it's been a year and a half.
Yeah,
all of these
feels longer.
You know, the vast majority, if not all of these decisions about who gets subways, who gets transit were made before you were a councillor. But these are unequal outcomes. Who do you think is responsible for that? Is it the city? Is it the province? Who has more jurisdiction over where subways are getting built?
Well, right now, as part of the agreement struck between the city and the province when the province attempted to upload the TTC, building subways is the jurisdiction of the province. So the best way to think of it is anything built underground is the province, anything built above ground is the city of Toronto. So who's deciding where subways get built right now is the province. And
do you think the province is doing enough for transit in Scarborough?
I think the province, everyone has an opinion. Everyone's going to criticize transit projects getting built. But at the same time, whatever you want to think of, the current provincial government, they've actually been building them. They are currently, I wouldn't be surprised if they got sort of a plan for the Shepherd Subway line before 2026. Everybody talked about building the Scarborough Subway. They actually did it. They're currently in discussions with extending the Yonge line up into Richmond Hill. So and they're currently building the Ontario line as well. So there's a lot of talk, a lot of criticism about how transit gets built, and a lot of it is fair and justified, but also you have to give credit for actually getting the transit built. And actually okay, we're just gonna do it, and being thankful that we're actually finally playing catch up after all of these years of just falling behind and not building the transit that we needed to support our city. Your viewers may or may not know this, but Eglington originally was supposed to be a subway. They were actually building that line during the Bob Ray years, and then when Mike Harris came in, there was a hole and they filled it up.
Right.
So imagine imagine how different the city would have been had we just finished that line that was already under construction. We wouldn't have had all these delays with the Eglinton Crosstown. That money could have been used for other things. So give credit where it's due. This government is actually building transit. Some of the reason that there has been a delay in building the crosstown is just the difficulty in building above a subway line that had been filled in. So there's just some technical difficulties with that as well.
Right. Speaking of the Eglinton LRT, a lot of residents in Scarborough that we spoke to about the Scarborough Subway extension are skeptical that that's going to be built on time because of the history of the Eglinton LRT and Metrolinx seemingly not being able to, present a timeline and nor being super transparent about their timeline. Do you think that Metrolinx has a transparency problem right now?
Oh, absolutely. I think, as good as they might be in getting projects done, you're a public agency. You're accountable to the public. You have to be transparent in how you do things in order for people to have confidence in how the decisions are being made. They might not agree with the decisions you make, but they will be more comfortable with them if they believe there is a transparent process as to how those decisions came about. And I think that's something that Metrolinx really has to focus on to get better. I think that's part of the reason there's a delay in a lot of their projects is people just don't trust them. So when you don't have that buy-in from the community, there's automatically sort of a backs against their wall attitude where if you had that trust, if you had that buy-in, maybe people would be more willing to give you the benefit of the doubt and these projects would move ahead faster.
The public has often been told public-private partnerships are more efficient than government building things. Is the Eglinton LRT an example of public-private partnership efficiency?
So Eglington Crosstown. Eglington Crosstown, I would say most people would say that it hasn't particularly worked out well in terms of how it was built with the public, with the private sector sort of building and maintaining it, and the public transit agencies supposed to operate it. There have been a lot of lessons learned. I'm obviously not privy to a lot of those discussions as that with Metrolinx, but I think it's fair to say that this particular partnership has not worked that well. However, we were in Waterloo about a couple months ago, and they also have a public-private partnership, but they did it the opposite way. The public actually built the railway, and the private sector is operating it. There, that partnership is working particularly well. And there's a lot of, they had their own lessons to learn, they had their own growing pains, but I think a lot of it depends on who are the actual players around the table, and what are the dynamics in terms of the type of project that are being built, what's the familiarity of the builder with this particular project, and just does it make sense maybe for the public to build these things and the private sector to operate them, or vice versa. I think we can say that a lot of these P3 projects in Ontario haven't been quite successful. I think Ottawa is another example. But there is an example in Waterloo where this appears to be working. So I wouldn't rule them out entirely. I would just say that they don't, in Toronto, they don't have and Metrolinx was not in charge of that one. That was done with the city of Waterloo or the regional Grand River Transit. So I will say that in that sort of model, it appears to be working. Metrolinx hasn't, I guess, figured out what's the right formula between private-public partnership or whether this is a funding model that should be pursued further in the future.
Who is being left behind in Scarborough when transit is not equal across the city?
I mean, I think all of Toronto. I think what we really saw in the pandemic was Scarborough is in a lot of ways the backbone of Toronto. That's where the people working in the hospitals work. That's where the people working in the schools work. That's where the people working in factories work. That's where a lot of our manufacturing and logistics hubs are. That's where a lot of people working in the Walmarts, the grocery stores, the home care workers, they're all living in Scarborough and they need to get to work in order to keep the city functioning. And when you have a population mostly racialized, mostly working class that can't get to where they're going, it holds everything back. So I think the city of Toronto is belatedly coming around to the realization that the future of this city is in Scarborough. It's pointing east. And we need to make sure that people have an efficient, safe, and convenient way to get around the city so that they can take advantages of opportunities throughout Toronto, but also in their own neighborhoods, in their own communities. Oftentimes when I'm looking at how to get around in Scarborough, it's either an hour on TTC or 8 minutes by driving. And I'm like, that's just not the community. It's not the community anymore. I think something like 16% of adults in Scarborough don't have driver's license. So this is a need, and there's a very young population in Scarborough too. They want to get around. They want to take advantages of what the city has to offer, and I think we have to offer that to them by just making sure we have fair, equitable, well-planned transit throughout all of Toronto.
Terrific. Well, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you.